All right, thank you everyone so much for being here. We have one more panelist who was here mere moments ago. Who'll be back. So you're in the From Resistance to Resilience session. If you're looking for more resistance, this is not the place for you. We're going to be chatting a little bit about NIMBYism in our mountain town communities and some stories on how we have overcome that, some stories on how we have not overcome that and the lessons we have learned. And I'm going to get you started off. I'm Siobhan Montoya Lavender. I am the Climate Action Development Director with EcoAction Partners. We're over on the Western Slope. We serve 3 very, very rural communities, and we're going to be hearing about them today. All right, I'm going to pass it over to my panel to introduce themselves. We're going to jump into questions for a bit. We're going to leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end, so I really want you to save your questions and think about how NIMBYism has impacted your town and your renewable projects. All right, Ryan, you want to take us away with the introductions?
Yeah, thanks, Siobhan, and hi, everyone. I know there's a lot of really awesome panels going on, so thank you for joining us. I'm Ryan. I'm with Protect Our Winters. We're a climate nonprofit that focuses on mobilizing the outdoor community to advocate for clean air, clean water, and a healthy planet, and we're very much scaling up our work on supporting clean energy projects.
Hi, everyone. I'm Casey Becker. I'm the CEO for COSA, the Colorado Solar and Storage Association. We are a trade association that represents about 250 renewable energy companies by working on policy, regulatory issues at the PUC, and also engaging in local land use decisions to support renewable energy.
Hi, everybody. I'm Emma Drona. I'm the Executive Director of EcoAction Partners. As Siobhan mentioned, we're a regional sustainability nonprofit in San Miguel, San Juan, and Ouray counties in southwest Colorado. I'm sitting in for my colleague Kim today. I am the one who came up with the idea for this panel and then tried to pass it off to our staff and not sit on it and was not allowed to do that. So happy to be sitting in today.
Got to work on your management skills. I'm Terry Schuyler. Sorry about my voice. I'm a town councilman in the town of Ridgway, former key accounts executive for San Miguel Power, which is a local rural cooperative that serves Ridgway and many of the communities that Siobhan was talking about. I retired a year ago. I'm now working on project managing a handful of grants, mostly for microgrids for community resiliency, part of the last presentation of the program that Julia Masters manages.
Terrific. Okay, so we're going to jump into it, guys. First of all, I'm going to go to you, Ryan, because I'm curious to kind of set the stage. We all have seen some reaction, some level of NIMBYism in our communities and resistance to these renewables. Paint a picture of us for what is the scale of renewables on the U.S.? Why are we building them?
Before we dive into the actual challenge all of us are working on, I want to try to paint a bigger picture for you all. So the U.S. grid is going through a pretty large transition right now. You've probably heard a lot about it today. I thought Professor Jacobson from Stanford did an awesome job covering this. But right now, our total installed electricity generating capacity in the U.S. is around 1,300 gigawatts. And that sounds like a confusing number to you. For the state of Colorado, we have about 20 gigawatts of generating capacity. A city like Seattle will often have a power demand of a gigawatt. So we're talking, 1,300 Seattle's worth of power. That demand is projected to grow pretty substantially in the U.S. as we electrify our buildings and our transportation, and as we see everyone's favorite topic these days, AI, start to build more and more data centers. And when we look at power demand projections in the next 10 years, we're looking at adding, another 800 plus gigawatts to the grid. Where's all of that going to come from? The answer is probably renewable sources, solar, wind, and batteries. Last year alone, 96% of new generation sources added to the grid were solar, wind, and batteries. Why is that happening? It's because they are the most cost-effective sources of power that we see today, even unsubsidized. If you look at great resources like Lazard comes out with a cost of energy report every year. The other reason is they're just faster to build. So you can build a utility scale solar plant once it's permitted and sited. You can build that in a matter of months. It's going to take you years to build a gas-fired combined cycle plant. So there's a lot of tailwinds. There's also some serious headwinds. I won't go into all of the details you all know about the One Big Beautiful Bill, if you want to call it that, and what's happening at the federal government level. But there's also a lot of community opposition that we're seeing. 15% of counties in the US have passed moratoriums blocking solar, wind, and storage projects. And the goal behind that is really to prevent these projects from being built, because a small number of people with a very loud voice are saying, I don't want this in my backyard. And all of us on this panel are trying to work on how can we turn that NIMBYism into YIMBYism. Yes, I want this in my backyard.
Thank you, Ryan. Okay, Terry, this one's for you. I'm curious from a utility perspective, why are we doing this community scale and large scale solar? Why aren't we just putting it on rooftops?
Good question. I would point to 3 primary reasons. One is demand, and I don't mean the kind of demand that you referred to. I meant a local demand from the demographics within our service territory. We have the local co-op has surveyed over the course of the years the folks. We have 10,000 members, 15,000 meters, pretty small co-op, although we serve 3,600 square miles. So it's a very rural, remote area. But within that membership, over 70% repeatedly have said that they're in favor of locally generated renewables, not just renewables on the grid that they purchase from far away, but locally generated renewables. The second reason is resilience. Resilience, not only the resilience afforded by solar that's connected to batteries, but the fact that when we generate locally, we're not as dependent upon transmitting that power from the faraway power generators. In our case, the nearest coal-fired power plant that supplies us is 130 miles away. So that power has to transfer through very expensive land, through very remote territory, and is subject to issues with regards to reliability. And the third is cost. We have the ability through a wholesale contract with our supplier, Tri-State, who's going to be presenting tomorrow, previously to supply up to 5% of our power locally, and that's being expanded to 20%. And as that ratio increases, the ability to site community scale solar, and we're actually looking at a 20 megawatt large utility scale solar project. The cost of that solar, especially with the grants that we're able to obtain, will actually bring down the cost of electricity to our members. So cost, resiliency, and local demand, I think, are the reasons that we're looking at it in our territory.
Okay, well, that sounds good, but why does it have to be in our backyard? I think one time, Emma, if I recall correctly, someone asked you, why can't we just put this in the desert? What do you say to them?
Yeah, I think it's really important to recognize how privileged we are to, for the most part in this country, and especially in these mountain towns, to walk into our homes, flip a switch, and the light turns on. You don't have to think about it. You don't think about where your power is coming from. You don't have to look at it. And I want to frame it as that. It is a privilege for that to happen, and that's not the case for a lot of less affluent communities in our country. And I think it's important to take responsibility for the power that we're utilizing and to take ownership of it for that reason. And I think there's a lot of technical reasons why we can't just put it in the desert with, again, to what Terry was saying, like proximity to where we're using this power and the cost of transmission lines. But also I think it's an exciting opportunity to, again, take that ownership, create resilience, and be leaders in this space.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. And Casey, I would like to kind of go into a bit of a Colorado perspective. I know here we are in Colorado. We have a lot of Colorado folks on our panel. Can you tell me a bit about what the policy landscape for renewables is and maybe why you think you're seeing some pushback from Coloradans?
Sure. So I want to just level set us for a second. So as was mentioned throughout this, the fastest and cheapest way to add new power into the grid is solar and wind. In Colorado, we're at about 43% renewable energy, but we want to get to 100%. A lot of that generation, that move to renewable energy, is being generated by people who live in the Front Range, and then also a lot of new generation from electrification and AI, data centers, things like that. There's a lot of fear that, oh my gosh, all this renewable energy is going to just swallow up all of our land. So to give a little perspective, 1 megawatt of solar is about 6 acres, and that 6 acres will feed about 160 homes. And so Colorado's about 7 million people. So that is a lot of megawatts, gigawatts, as Ryan said. So the cheapest way to do that is large-scale solar. And that large-scale solar, so if you do 1 megawatt at 6 acres, if you're doing 100 megawatts, that's 600 acres. And so people are nervous about their view sheds primarily. They are worried about loss of agricultural land. The truth is, there's Colorado's 60 million acres. 30 million acres are in some way designated ag. And for us to reach our goals to get to 100% clean energy, we need about 80,000 additional acres for solar. So it is a teeny tiny fraction, but it has the feeling for a lot of communities of really taking over. And we'd like to do more on rooftops and on parking lots, but that is a more expensive type of solar, so there are trade-offs. So what ends up happening is a lot of communities, either because it's more expensive or because they don't want it in their backyards, say, build that on the Eastern Plains. The Eastern Plains is where the big transmission lines are. And, look, Xcel and utility, they love getting more money to build transmission lines because that's how they make their money. So there's a strong push, not only in mountain towns, but in a lot of rural communities in general, to say, no, we don't want this. We don't want this in rural Morgan County, Washington County, Logan County, Saguache County, because that's feeding you guys everywhere else. We don't want this power. And so we are seeing a lot of pushback in small rural counties, not just mountain towns, who are worried about view sheds, but all the other counties saying, we're not generating the need for this. So we do see a lot of pushback right now across the state. These decisions, these land use decisions, are made at a county level typically. And so each county gets to pass its own land use code. And we have seen things in Colorado, counties say things like, you can build solar, but your panels have to be white, which is not a thing. And like Boulder County, where I live, says you can't build anything more than 7 acres. Now, Boulder is generating a lot more need for renewable power than they are willing to actually locate in their own county.
Okay, it sounds like I was swindled on those white solar panels I bought. All right, I'm really curious to kind of get into some case studies, and I want you all to be thinking about the case studies in your own communities and how this could apply and questions that relate. So let's start with Emma and Terry. Give us a few examples of some projects that failed due to pushback, and what lessons did you learn? Let's start with Emma.
Okay, so one project that we worked on that I want to talk about is a microgrid plan that we received a grant for the town of Ophir. I grew up in Ophir. It's a town of just under 200 people outside of Telluride, so really small, tight-knit community, and very close to my heart. And we received a grant in partnership with our utility provider to create a plan to look at what solar could look like. And that plan was voted against, because if you have the plan, then the solar will be built. And there was quite a few lessons learned throughout that project. And I think one of the primary ones was not assuming how anyone will feel about renewables in their community based on their political affiliation, based on their votes on other sustainability projects, based on them voting for the grant in the first place. I think checking in frequently with people and not making those assumptions was something that we missed out on, and we've seen how Ophir has voted in the past, and it was very different on this project. We also saw that the vocal minority had a huge influence. So there was a couple key community members that are really respected and really well heard that were against this project, and they went door to door asking their neighbors to vote against it, and were listened to, and it was maybe more in the sense of keeping the peace than necessarily being against the project, but people respected those 3 individuals in this town. So finding those people early on, sitting down with them one-on-one before your project goes public so that you can hear their concerns, get them on your side, and get them to go door to door to their neighbors for you instead of against you is really essential. And I think another issue we ran into was that there were 2 plots of land that were potential sites for this project because of where the transmission lines were and where connectivity could happen. And when we went to the community and said, we're deciding between these two sites, they were upset that we didn't involve them in choosing the land. And so, again, technically, those were the only places it made sense, but people wanted to be a part of that decision process. So I think creating that ownership early on, and even if we know that those are the sites that work, coming to them of, let's look at the sites that you want to propose, and these are the criteria that we need for solar to make sense in our community. You narrow it down, and giving people that involvement and that ownership would have been really helpful. And the last thing I'll mention on that project is walking a really careful line between approaching a community really early on before you have a site, before you know how much solar you need for that community, before you know how much it will cost, versus doing all the planning and then coming in and saying, this is the project. And there's a balance there of wanting to have enough information that you can have productive conversations, but again, giving people that ownership and early communication so they feel like they're part of the process the whole time. And that looks a little different depending on the community and depending on the project. So kind of finding that line depending on where you're working.
Yeah, I thought those were some great insights. Terry, you want to talk to us a little bit more about some failed attempts to have solar?
Well, fortunately, the utility hasn't had many examples of failed approaches, but there was a project in our service territory that was proposed by a local large-scale developer. And echoing a lot of what you said as lessons learned, these folks, the developer themselves, didn't employ any of these lessons up front. And they went and employed a typical large developer utility algorithm where they look for transmission, not only just transmission, but transmission that had capacity on it. They then secured a state land lease that's right underneath that line. And then they went and knocked on neighbors' doors and convinced the neighbors next to the state land lease to sign up for, the benefits of leasing their land. Once they did all of that and they designed, it was 100 megawatt, which was 600 acres to the statistics that Casey had mentioned. Then they brought it to the community. The community was completely taken off guard and you had never heard of the project. It was going to be in their view corridor. They came to the meetings with pitchforks. They rallied full-on onslaught of misinformation. They claimed the thing was going to leak toxins into the groundwater and it's going to pollute the night sky and the sound was going to disturb the elk corridors, and just came with all of this misinformation and rallied the negative support of the local community. The lesson that the utilities learned from that, and watching that, we were just sort of a spectator, and they didn't even approach us on it because the energy would not have gone on local distribution, it would have gone on transmission, which wouldn't have been something that the local utility had any clause into. Was the idea of, and it was required of the $10 million grant we put in, we're working on a 20 megawatt system, required a community benefit plan which engages the stakeholders early in the process. I mean, before any of the details of the project are known to the community, you garner the community support first with the local town representatives, then with the local nonprofits, then with the ag community, and you incorporate in the community benefit plan tangible benefits from the result of the system, including actual money spent for things like the example they gave us in the the grant guidance was purchase a local grain elevator for the local community, or put a microgrid in the town hall, or add new park benches to the town park. But basically generate community support before you go into the details of the technology so that you have a favorable impression going in. The other lesson that came out of that was solicit the negative input first. Secure that first no, so then you know how to navigate around it. So rather than being surprised late in the process with a large no, get the no's up front and then work to navigate the yeses around that. So those are some of the lessons from a project that was in our territory but that we didn't actually instigate.
Okay, the next question is, so we work out on the Western Slope. We work in a red congressional district. We also, however, work with Telluride and Ophir and these other more liberal communities. I'm curious, and this is for anyone on the panel, why do you think we're seeing pushback to renewable energies across the political spectrum when it comes to installing them in people's backyard? Jump in, anybody.
So we have very very red counties who are saying, we don't want this in our backyard because we don't support this energy transition anyway, and the power isn't staying local. And by the way, also not a thing, you can't control where the electrons go, okay? So there's no, like, these are my electrons and they're not yours. But so that's what you hear on the red side. And then on the blue side, there are a lot of counties who are like, we're too precious and we don't want this in our backyard. We want that to be in someone else's backyard. We want to drive the change for this, but we are not going to want to see it, you know, again, it's a visual thing, or like, are we losing ag land? So everyone has the reason, but yet everyone at this conference, as we talk about heat pumps, as we talk about EVs, none of that matters if you're not supporting that load with renewable energy, because otherwise you're just electrifying stuff and it's being supported by, you know, gas and coal. So we have to, you know, we have to support the policies like all through to actually make an energy transition happen, to actually slow down the impacts of climate. So a lot of times people aren't making that connection. They aren't making the connection of, you know, I want to have an EV and therefore I'm going green. But if you're not supporting the renewable energy to get on the grid, it doesn't matter that you bought the EV. And so there's missing that connection. There's wanting it to be local. There's not wanting visual impacts. Or there's this like idea of really sort of outsourcing impacts to another place. And there are some, you know, Weld County in Colorado is very friendly to solar development because they just are very all of the above. You want to build gas, you want to build oil, gas, they'll take it all. And then there are counties who are like, we don't want any of it.
Yeah, I'd follow up with, like, we're not just seeing this in Western Colorado. Like, I live on the Western Slope. We're just seeing it across the U.S. So Pew came out with some really interesting research lately polling Americans, and there is a partisan gap forming between who supports renewable energy projects and who is against renewable energy projects. And we work with, you know, 200 professional athletes at Protect Our Winters, 100 brands, a lot of scientists and creative storytellers. And our goal is to try to start to combat some of the misinformation that we're seeing online, which is definitely contributing to that gap that we're seeing. And even Pew points to that in their research. So our goal is to help educate the outdoor community in particular about what are the facts for these projects, and often, you know, how do we dispel myths, right? Many people will point to wind projects and talk about the number of birds that they kill. But more birds are killed every single year just from the windows in our buildings, the windows in our homes. And that's not the most wonderful message.
And the cats in our homes.
And the cats in our homes, exactly. And that's not the most wonderful message to share to the public, but like our goal is to help combat that disinformation by using trusted messengers. And we're finding today, and you probably know this in your own life, you're getting your information, whether it's the news or the recent political debates or news on clean energy, you're probably following someone on Instagram, TikTok, and other places. And we have a lot of trusted messengers. We're equipping them with like the best science and climate solutions that they can have to go out to the public and try to dispel more of those myths so we can start combating what we're seeing online. Yeah, Terry?
Yeah, I'd like to partially modify the premise of that question. So rather than just a political difference, one of the things we've recently observed in trying to place a battery that would power an entire town for 4 hours was a cultural difference. It's not just politics, it's culture. In this case, it was a very small community that's on the end of a radial feeder. They're an ideal candidate for a battery system because the line goes over 11,000-foot pass, it crosses a river 3 times, goes through woods. They're the smallest community that SMPA serves, and they have the most power outages. And we presented the various locations for this battery to the Board of Trustees, and we got pushback from the mayor and a couple of the councilors, not so much based on politics, but based on the fact that they embody sort of the old school, the old world way of this romantic notion of living in a community that's resistant to the change, resistant to the internet, resistant to anything that's modern. And one of the comments we got from one of the local officials was, when we have a power outage, it's the highest quality lifetime that my family has. They put down their cell phones, they put down their iPhones, we light candles, and if it lasts for more than a few hours, we roll the refrigerator into the garage. So, you know, my knee-jerk reaction to that is, we'd be happy to turn off your power anytime you want if you want that quality of life. And if you'd rather that battery, we'll send you a box of candles and a dolly for your refrigerator. But the fact is, without being flippant, I learned by observing that comment that there's a cultural a romance associated with lack of change. And even though, we're flabbergasted, it's like, you have the most utility outages, your constituents, some of which may be on oxygen generators or rely on electric heat, may not feel the same way you do, but nonetheless you have to embrace that cultural shift and then reframe the way you approach this in order to determine how this could be perceived as a benefit. In the case of this particular project, we're looking at placing it at a school that had been abandoned because of asbestos mitigation. And so part of the pitch from the utility is, we'll put the battery at this closed down school property, we'll re-energize the school and help you eventually turn that school into a resilience hub. And so all of a sudden that provides more than just the perceived benefit of the utility coming in and dictating, that we're going to fix your problems. All of a sudden we're going from the ground up and trying to garner, support from below, essentially.
Yeah, no, I think those are great points. And I like your framing about this idea, this kind of bucolic view of the past. And I think I myself can fall into that category at times. I'm sure many of us who chose to live in these mountain towns could. And so finding the ways to kind of create change in a way that fosters the best solutions for those communities. And I loved what Casey said too about this. A lot of times the energy is being generated one place and it's going somewhere else. And unsurprisingly, folks don't want a giant solar array that isn't going to reduce their own energy costs. And how can we then encourage some of those larger places to have energy generated closer to them? All right, Casey, this one's for you. Can you tell me a little bit about kind of what are the state policies that can either hinder or foster these kind of community outreach initiatives? And what are you seeing? And like there's decision makers and policy makers in the room. What are you seeing?
So Colorado, in terms of the Mountain West, I think is really leading on an energy transition. And all of that happens, that happens at the state legislature, and then the PUC and other utilities are charged with implementing that. And then you have the local utilities and local governments that actually have to, permit things. And so it's a lot of layers of bureaucracy and a lot of layers of change that have to happen to make all of this work. But your question was more about say it again?
Like, I'm thinking about how can we create policy that also fosters a sense of YIMBYism.
Yeah, I don't think it's easy. I just today got in my inbox a draft bill from a state senator who lives on the Eastern Plains, who's said, I want to share with you this legislation I'm running that's going to keep renewable energy out of my, out of Eastern Colorado. And so, there will probably be responses that are legislation that says, if you aren't going to allow this more locally, we are going to create a state law that either, creates more state levers for this. So I think if we can avoid those types of fights, but it takes a lot of work. There's a lot of NGOs here, and there is a lot of effort to dispel myths. The concern that solar panels are going to cause glare, and that's why you don't want them. Also not a thing, right? Solar is intended to absorb light, not reflect it. But that batteries are going to get into your water and cause water quality issues. So there's a lot of effort to dispel those myths, but I agree that this is cultural. So a lot of it is, do we need the state policy, or do we need to be reaching out to people who are a little bit different than us to say, here are the benefits in your community? If we can create more incentives in local governments to want to do this, it's not easy to to make that happen. And there are challenges at the state level with, it's not like there's just a big bucket of money and you can just start passing it out. So we need to figure out what those incentives are. And then we also need to spend more time, as has been mentioned, talking to people and trying to cross that cultural divide.
I just want to follow up on that too with an example. From the project that Terry was talking about, we had our solar land use codes redone in San Miguel County that are now one of the most stringent in the state. And it went through this year-long process that was really tense, and consistently at all of those meetings had a lot of people showing up to share their concerns about solar in their backyard. And it was mostly because of this project that was proposed in the wrong way and then bled into this policy that's now impacting permitting for all solar projects in our community. But in talking to our local elected officials, they said they needed to listen to their concerned constituents. So they wrote into the land use codes misinformation, proving that the solar won't have glare, proving that the solar won't have soil impacts, proving that it won't have noise impacts, all of these things and it won't shed light at night to impact dark sky communities. Like, all of these things are now included as study requirements in our land use codes to have solar permitted, even though it's misinformation, because our elected officials wanted to appear that they were listening to the concerned citizens. So 2 lessons from that, and I think one of them is showing up and speaking out in support of these things, because people are way more willing to show up when they're upset with something and to speak strongly, and it's just really important to be on the positive side of that conversation. And the other takeaway from that is now the only solar companies that can apply for these projects are the bigger utility scale projects, because the barriers to entry are so high that our smaller community scale businesses don't have the staff or capacity financially to go through the permitting process. So we're still in that phase of figuring out what those impacts are, but showing up when those decisions are being made, even if you're in favor of these projects, is so important.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's something we have these coffee and climate chats we run, and every time, like, what's something I could do? I'm like, show up to the county commissioner meeting and say you like solar, or say you like composting, or say you like recycling, because the people who don't like it will certainly show up. All right, so when we were planning this panel, I looked at Emma and I said, okay, well, we have plenty of examples of where things didn't go well and how we learned from that. We really want to have some success stories too. So this is for anybody, but mostly Ryan. Could you tell me about a time that some opposition to a renewable development project was transformed into support?
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about, I think we've talked about culture. We've also talked about misinformation. What we really haven't talked about, we partner with this group called Greenlight America. They do really fantastic work on trying to help get utility scale projects greenlit for their siting and their construction. What their CEO, Matt Traldi, often says is, we're just losing by forfeit. We are, to your point, not showing up at the town hall meeting. We're not showing up for the county commissioner meeting, and we're just losing by forfeit. We're fortunate that we work with those hundreds of trusted messengers that I mentioned earlier. We also have about 100,000 volunteer members who work with Protect Our Winters, and our goal is, moving forward, we've been working on it the past few years, and we're really picking it up this year and moving forward, is to show up to support these types of utility scale solar projects. And I want it to be cool to go with your friends and POW athletes to a town council meeting and talk about that project and make your testimony that you want that project in your backyard and in your area, and you want to see the benefits for it. So we've worked on one project in my backyard. I live out in the Aspen area, and Holy Cross was working on a project with Primergy. It's only 5 megawatts, very much a community scale project, but they were facing all of the NIMBYism challenges we've talked about earlier. Glare, blocking the bike path, and a ton of issues. But what we did is we leveraged Chris Davenport, who's a professional skier, very well known for skiing all of the 14ers here in Colorado. He wrote an op-ed, letters to the editor. He also published it on his social media feeds. He showed up at the town council and county commissioner meetings and said, I want this project. I want to be able to ski for generations to come. My children want to ski, and he was able to break through. We can't say that Chris made the difference on that project, but we need people like Chris to show up. The same is true this year. There's been a project in outside Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's been a long way in the by AES, but it's a 96 megawatt project for solar and storage. And that project has faced a lot of NIMBYism as well, mostly around the storage side of the project. Many people are concerned around the safety of batteries in their community. They're concerned about thermal runaway and the project igniting. There are lots of precautions that everyone is taking to prevent this, from actual, battery management systems that can monitor the temperature of every single cell in a system like that, to just codes for how you place distance between each of the battery packs, to even having just sprinkler systems in those types of facilities that can put those fires out before they start. We leveraged one of our Alliance members. His name's Ricky Gates. He's a pro runner, and just like Chris, he wrote letters to the editor, op-eds in the local paper. He showed up at the county commissioner meeting, and again, we can't take credit for getting that project across the finish line, but we did show up. Ricky showed up, and that project recently was passed unanimously by the county commissioners. It's still facing some opposition, but we need to make sure that a small, very loud group of people don't become like the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. We need to make sure a bigger group of people, the 2/3 of Americans who believe climate change is real and want to see action on it, show up and support these types of projects in their community. And it's not hard. We in Greenlight can give you step-by-step instructions to show up to town council and make a public comment or write an op-ed in your local paper.
I'll briefly mention one successful project that we originally or initially had pretty significant pushback, again, from the vocal minority. The town had a master plan for a local park. It had been sitting on a shelf for 10 or 15 years. They slowly developed a community garden and a community apiary. And then through the planning grant through DOLA, SMPA took a look at how could we revise this park in order to put in a significant amount of solar in this 12-acre park that would then provide the RECs to allow the town's ambition to go net zero by 2030 to manifest, meaning that there'd be solar generation to offset the electric use from all the going all electric and the fuel switching. So the town council authorized a $25,000 redo of the master plan. The park was actually on literally Green Street, and so we called it the Green Street Sustainability Park, and initially had 425 kilowatts of solar on it, and that brought a lot of the local residents out saying, wait a minute, that's like an industrial solar system, even though it's a small community. It was on 2 acres or so. And we got a lot of pushback, mostly from the local residents that would be in most close proximity to it. We then went through 3 or 4 public engagement processes with the stickers and the maps and the kids and the soft drinks and the snacks. Somebody said snacks earlier today. Snacks are important. And we eventually came up with a design compromise where we took the community solar and cut it in half, but then took the remaining capacity and broke it into 5 smaller solar systems throughout the park, one of which was a solar shade structure on a new bathroom. Another was an outdoor learning center. The park happens to be within a block of the school, so it would be an outdoor learning center with kiosks in it that show all of the benefits of the sustainable landscaping, sustainable water use, the bouldering wall, all of the fun parts of the park. A solar carport with an EV charger, a solar shade structure in the community garden, and then a vertical solar fence, which would act as a windscreen to prevent the wind from blowing heavily into the garden. So we effectively worked with the community to overturn this impression that this is an industrial solar system. And by the way, the remaining 200 kilowatts of community solar is now an agrivoltaic. It's going to be planned for agrivoltaics with pollinating plants for the apiary. And the apiary then works with a community garden. So there's this little synergistic loop. But the point is that we had to go out early. We got the early no's. We looked at reframing it. We redesigned it thanks to the funds provided by DOLA from the planning grant. And now that master plan has been sanctioned by the town council, and we're out seeking the funding to go out and build out the components of this new Green Street Sustainability Park, which would be almost like a theme park, essentially. So anyway, it was a win-win ultimately.
It's a win-win, and you turned them around. And I think also, if I remember you saying, is you asked people to show up to the next town council and not just allow the minority loud voices, but those in favor too. Terrific. All right, I'm going to have one more last question, then I want to get to your, we want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. So in the spirit of what my colleague Kim said is like listening more than telling, I want to ask this question of, if a community member just found out that the solar is coming to their community, what will be a question you would ask them, particularly if they were somebody who has historically said, I love solar, but not here? What would you ask them rather than tell them?
It's a hard question to narrow it down to one thing because there's so many questions to ask. I think after setting the stage for why we're having these conversations, asking them what an ideal project would look like for them and how they want to lead in this space. Because I think what we found in all of this pushback across the spectrum of political or the community or whoever it is this commonality of caring for the community. And whether it's the view shed or agricultural rights or whatever it is, people are pushing back on these projects because of their perceived care for their community. So I think asking what it looks like for them to conserve their community and protect this land and protect their way of life, and how they can get creative about being leaders in these developments and what that would look like to them, to kind of get that creativity piece coming from the community.
Yeah. Anyone else? A question you'd ask?
I really like that ideal project question. I think I would ask the community, like, what is not so much what I think I would follow with your ideal question, but I want to ask people, like, what are the end goals that you care about in your community? Because I think, I live in rural America, but it's a different rural America than many rural Americas. And I've been to Hayden, Colorado recently for a geothermal event, and I've been to a few other places to check out these types of communities and projects. And what really inspired me is, like, people care about the 4th of July fireworks. Like, they care about the county fair. And how do you help support those, like, end goals, those desired outcomes that community has through these types of projects? And I think the community benefit agreements that Terry was talking about earlier are a fantastic way to do that. And even for developers, just getting somebody on the ground who is, like, becoming part of the community and listening to the community and understanding their needs. Like, we may not agree on the exact details of the project, but if we can get everyone's end goals met, I often think we can actually get the project passed.
I like it. Okay. Anything to add, or should we jump into Q&A? Q&A? All right. Who has questions? Who's had NIMBYism in their community? I'm going to run around. Here we go.
Okay. Hi, Max Becker with Utah Clean Energy. And it's been a huge bummer not having the IRA anymore. And one of the main reasons for that in our communities is that there's no longer a focus on LIDAC in a specific way. But what I want to touch on right now is workforce. And we ended up doing a lot of work in trying to get pre-weatherization funds, wood fire stove replacements on tribal lands, like super basic interventions to make, like, in-home air quality better. Like, we're not even talking like large scale emissions. And there are not solar installers. There are not electricians. And right now we're doing a big transmission project in Delta, Utah and Central Utah at the Intermountain Power Plant. And that, you drive by there and it's all Texas license plates, because that union work is cheaper from West Texas than it is from Salt Lake City. And so I'm curious what Colorado is focusing on in workforce, as we don't have the funding that's pushing for those goals anymore.
I am a former state legislator with my friend Mike Foote right there. He was in the state Senate, I was in the House, and there is nothing more popular with a legislator than a workforce development bill. It is like, people are like, I want to do work because it is like, I'm supporting jobs and I'm supporting people and I'm supporting my community. There is actually huge, I mean, this is Colorado, but I bet even in Utah, but so come up with the idea and pitch it to a legislator and they would love it, even if it's like, and Colorado has a shortage of electricians right now, and I think sometimes there are efforts to to tamp down on like the number of electricians. But so I would say do that. And then, we in Colorado had a Solar for All grant. Utah did too. A big chunk of that was workforce. The Solar for All grants were EPA grants. It was $7 billion nationally. Again, Utah and Colorado both got them. And it's in litigation. So I am hopeful that those grants will get restored and those workforce projects, efforts will move forward. In Colorado, we have Grid Alternatives, and they do a lot of workforce work. And then like the city of honestly, like coming into this solar space, I was overwhelmed with the amount of workforce opportunities. The city of Denver has one, Colorado Energy Office has one, then there was the EPA one. There's a lot out there. Sometimes I think we don't do a great job of like creating one-stop shopping to figure it all out. But, I think even those Utah legislators like workforce development legislation. They like putting money into it. I can't even tell you how many workforce development bills I saw in my 4 terms at the Capitol.
The one thing I'll add to that, we at EcoAction Partners have an energy workforce development program where we're providing stipends to folks to get trained in these fields. And it's funded by our local granting foundation. It's funded by Tri-State in partnership with our utility at SMPA. And so I think if you're in the situation where the legislation isn't passing and it's not working at the state level, finding those community groups that can be the champions of this work on a local level, where we as a nonprofit can see in our communities where we're missing that workforce and what specific industries really need that demand the most, and bring funding to the table to kind of incentivize folks to take the time to do the training, to switch careers, or enhance their current business to make it more sustainable.
Okay, other people. I saw hands up over here.
Hi, Megan Moore-Kemp with Mountain Parks Electric. Thank you for your presentations. You touched on this, but I want to just say it a different way. I think our rural communities have been asked to carry a pretty big weight with respect to the energy transition. And I would like to hear specifics from you regarding how rural communities see the benefits of carrying that weight. What are the specific benefits to rural communities?
It's interesting. I haven't experienced, or at least we haven't experienced to a limited degree, the issue of we're generating power for somebody else. So most of the projects that we've been engaged in have been very locally centric projects where the benefits will be derived locally. Now that one project that I mentioned that failed, it was within San Miguel County, and San Miguel County has Telluride ski resort, which is now approaching a Vail, Aspen-like cost of living, versus the west end of the community, which is more agricultural, rural, sheep and cattle ranching. And their perception was, even though the system was going to be sited in their front yard, literally, that the benefits to the electricity were to go to feed the rich people in Telluride. So it was an east versus west, which was like mind-blowing. It's like, really, you guys are 20 miles away from each other. So there was this division that erupted as part of that. But generally speaking, I don't know that I've experienced what you said, which is the rural communities carrying the water for other communities. Most of the folks in our service territory are looking for the local benefit of the renewable energy.
And the projects we're pursuing, for the most part, are ones that have co-benefits for these communities. So it's not just the energy production benefits. We're looking at the resiliency piece and pairing it with batteries, especially for our communities that face a lot of power outages due to the extreme weather. So trying to find that resilience piece, and then tying into what Terry was saying, the community benefit aspect, and that can depend on what your community wants. But building that in as an expectation for these bigger projects, that you will invest in the community based on what they're requesting. Yeah.
You know, I'm not going to state the obvious, but I guess I am going to, which is the primary benefit is the benefit to the planet. But the next benefit is cheaper power. I mean, renewable energy is just cheaper. I pay Mountain Parks electric bills. I cannot freaking believe how expensive my power is at Mountain Parks through Mountain Parks Electric. So your primary benefit is going to be that it's actually much cheaper to do. And then it can help specifically with agrivoltaics keep farmers keep land in production. So a lot of folks can't, they're not generating enough revenue. We are now seeing solar panels used for windbreaks. We're seeing panels used over, ditches to help lessen evaporation. A cooler planet is going to be a better planet to live on, but we're also seeing with agrivoltaics, healthier soils. And then, this stuff does have to get built, and it does create jobs. It does help farmers keep their land going, and it lowers prices. So I think there's a lot of benefits. I think there's just this perception that it is a burden. It doesn't have to be viewed as a burden. It can be a benefit. And a lot of counties can get community benefit agreements. They just don't know how to do it. They aren't familiar with it. And that's something, as I'm saying it, I'm like, I don't know, maybe my organization can figure out how to work on that. But, like in Colorado, we have CCI, Colorado Counties, Inc. That's something CCI could do, is help train counties on what are the community benefits you can get that lead them to actually approve a project when it goes through permitting.
I'll just add one really quick point, which is just tax revenue. I think when we look across communities, especially here in Western Colorado, it is predominantly an oil and gas based economy. And so as we transition to more renewables, the tax base for many of these counties and towns is starting to shrink over time, and we need to offset that with other forms of tax revenue. And solar projects and the property associated with those is a great opportunity to do that.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions. There's so many hands. What do I do? I'm going to go close, and then I'm going to go far, okay?
Hi, my name's Sarah. I'm with the National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden. I want to kind of piggyback on the workforce question and push it a little bit further, because it's more than just kind of expanding the workforce. It's also addressing concerns about, fossil fuel industry employees being phased out. So I'm curious how you've addressed that concern about kind of reskilling and upskilling, and if you've specifically, started any initiatives to address that, et cetera.
Again, on a very local level, we've been talking about that at EcoAction Partners for a specific community, and I think that there's a huge translation of skills that we've seen from the fossil fuel industry to renewable energy, especially with geothermal opportunities, and we've talked about that a lot and what that could look like for thermal energy networks and helping to retrain folks to kind of this new emerging industry. And I think, again, creating those opportunities to help fund that training and make it worth it for folks to go through that process, because it is a big change in their lives. And I think people are often resistant to that, knowing that that transition is already happening naturally because of the way that the market is going. So I think creating those resources, creating the education, and finding those points where there is that skill transfer that feels really natural.
When I was in the state legislature, I created the Just Transition Office. So I ran this legislation. Not a single Just Transition community actually supported the legislation when I did it. But I got it passed and signed by the governor, and it's being implemented now. And it is a small office that is charged with thinking through solutions. And the one thing that I learned when I was working on this, trying to get stakeholder support, was they didn't want, at the time they were like, we are not transitioning, so we don't need your Just Transition Office. And then they were like, we don't want you telling us how we transition, state of Colorado. So a lot of it is, the state does need to have the resources and needs to be, provide technical assistance, and needs to help the county, provide the tools so the county can decide for itself what that looks like. Is it some other, energy resource? Is it transitioning, changing, adapting to being more of a recreation-based economy? It might not be any of those things that we even know about right now, but I do think that in Colorado, we've created at least one source to help think through these things.
Okay, I saw a question. Oh, right there?
I thought it was good.
All right, here and here. We'll go quickly, okay?
All right. My name is Alex. I'm a CU Boulder master's candidate. One of the things one of you mentioned is losing by forfeit. I've done work in this in the past, and it's because people in rural areas get attacked by their neighbors. And so what do we do about that? How do we defend the people who are willing to advocate for these projects when they are going to bear the brunt of the negative social consequences?
Yeah, great question, and we should try to get you involved with Protect Our Winters. I think we're trying to do two things, and I'm very open to learning more. We should chat after. But I think the first thing for us is just making sure we're equipping both our Alliance members and our volunteers with like a set of talking points that help them combat that misinformation and help them de-escalate conversations. So we meet with everyone prior to these meetings and make sure that they have what they need before going in. And I think the second piece that we're really focused on is just like leaning in with curiosity. I think often I was even just working with a local group on a air source heat pump project for apartment building in the Aspen area, and most of the people just needed to be listened to who were causing most of that opposition. And when we started to listen to their concerns, like one person just really did not want someone coming into her apartment and tearing apart the drywall. And we let them know it could be done in less than a day. And then she was immediately on board. So I really think if you listen to the concerns of everybody who is opposing the project, you can often find a workaround for them.
Okay, one last question. We have a minute and a half left. Here we go.
Quick one. Aaron with Millig Design Build. Have you guys ran into any pushback or issues with smaller communities trying to add solar to their existing infrastructure and running into like rules that said they could not add those systems?
Well, we've experienced the moratorium issue, and typically it's from the ideological perspective of one or two county commissioners that put in place rules in the moratorium that make it impossible to forward a project. But one of the things I'd like to come back to, and it's back to one of your questions, and hopefully it partly answers yours, and it's back to the concept of NIMBYism, which is where we started here, is I recall a local community opponent to a solar community garden that was going to be on the opposite side of the valley and said, I don't want to have to look across the valley and see that solar system. Well, probably a half a dozen times this year, you couldn't see across the valley because of the smoke from the forest fires. And like the other side of the valley, it was all evergreen. So, you know, I posed the question to him. I said, if we don't act now and we don't act locally, you may not be able to see the forest over there because the forest will be gone, and you won't be able to see even if it's there because of the smoke in the air. And that kind of gave, you know, I was trying not to be flippant, but put greater context to the whole thing. And they internalized that and said, you know, that's an interesting point, and maybe we should reconsider our perspectives.
All right, thank you everyone so much for coming. Best of luck with NIMBYs in your community. Come chat with us afterwards.